Okay, so now we're going to talk about something that's outside of the lungs, but very, very important to to respiration, which is or are the pleuria. So some of you may never have heard of the pleuria before, but what the pleuria are membranes that help us breathe, and we'll get to that in just a minute. So let's first talk about the lungs. The size, though, they're obviously big enough to fill your chest cavity, except for the area where your heart is, because, yeah, your heart's there, and large blood vessels. The apex is the narrow part of each lung, under the clavicle or the collarbone, and the base is next to the diaphragm. It's the broadest part. The pleuria are these nice slippery membranes that line the chest cavity or the thoracic cavity and covers the outer surface of the lungs. Now, there are two pleuria, okay? The visceral and the parietal. And between the two is this nice thin fluid that allows the pleuria to slide past one another easily as we're breathing in and breathing out as ventilation happens. And it allows, or it reduces the amount of friction, which would be obviously really bad for a very delicate tissue like the lungs. So just take a second, put your two hands together and rub them. What do you feel? Well, I'm not there with you, but I know that when I do this, I feel heat. Heat is not a very habit-forming thing for delicate tissues like the lungs. And in fact, if you kept rubbing your hands together, you'd probably start developing in some areas calluses. Again, lungs, very delicate, 2 cell layers between the areas where CO2 and oxygen are at high versus low concentrations, right? So you don't want super thick tissue growing in these areas. So I don't know what happened there. Let's go back to where we were a second ago. You jump forward. Sorry about that. So the pleuria are these slippery membranes that line the thoracic cavity. That would be the parietal pleuria. And there's another pleuria surrounding the lungs. Between the two is a nice layer of fluid that reduces friction. And, of course, that makes sense because you don't want a lot of friction and heat to build up as you're breathing in and breathing out. Oops. All right, there we go. Sometimes things jump ahead. Now, this particular figure I've kind of labeled up before we got going here. What I want you to pay attention to is that the left and the right lungs have 3 lobes. So on the right lung, there's the right superior, right middle, and right inferior lobes. 1, 2, 3. And separating each lobe is what we call a fissure. So you have the horizontal fissure because it looks pretty horizontal, and then the oblique fissure separating the middle and the inferior lobe. So I just put those down as A and B. On the left side, we only have 2 lobes, the left superior lobe and the left inferior lobe, separated by an oblique fissure. So oblique kind of means diagonal, all right? Horizontal is just horizontal, right? So in this figure, what you're looking at is the separation of the primary bronchi into smaller bronchi that will lead into the alveoli of the lungs. If we go on ahead and take a cross-section through an individual and look down on the body, what we're going to look at here are the pleuria associated with the lungs and the thoracic cavity. So anterior is down here, posterior is here. You can tell this is posterior because this is a vertebra. Right here you have the sternum, so that's anterior. The heart is in the middle, of course, and the heart is going to be sending blood out through the pulmonary the pulmonary artery. Remember, that's deoxygenated blood. And then we do have a pulmonary vein draining back to the heart, okay, right here in red, characterized, by the red. So that's going to be a vein. Again, this is the only place in the body where arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood. Arteries and veins are designated by direction of blood flow, not oxygen content. Now, what I really wanted to show you here was the distribution of the pleuria. So the green line here is the visceral pleuria. Viscera kind of means like gut. And then the blue line right here is the parietal pleuria. And these two areas have a very, very small separation. In fact, they kind of zip back and forth on each other right here. So the visceral turns into parietal. And like I said before, between the two, we have a thin layer of fluid that helps eliminate friction. So again, rubbing your hands together, producing friction, bad thing for delicate tissues. We already saw this in the heart with the pericardium. Okay, so what's the function of, obviously, the lungs and the pleuria? So the function is to help facilitate breathing in and releasing air. That's pulmonary ventilation. We'll get to that in a little bit. Pleurisy is an inflammation of the actual pleural membranes. And so sometimes what happens is as the pleuria become inflamed, they start making more and more fluid. And that puts pressure on the lungs. The lungs aren't able to inflate as well. So that leads to, and this is one that I always have a hard time saying, atelectasis, oh my gosh, atelectasis. All right, so you guys, I'm so sorry. Every now and again, I run across a word that I have a hard time saying. But basically, in this case, you have the incomplete ventilation of the lung, or the incomplete expansion of the lung. And in fact, the lungs all the way down to the alveoli can collapse. And this can be caused from two things, something called a pneumothorax. What that means is that air can come into the pleural space. So let's go back a slide. A pneumothorax happens when air gets into, let me get a different color here. Let's go with let's try fluorescent. Well, no, we already have fluorescent green. When air gets into this space right here, I made it purple. That can happen if somebody gets injured, if somebody falls, let's say, somebody gets punctured. All right. A pneumothorax results when air gets in there. We also have a hemothorax. That's really bad, the presence of blood in the pleural space. So that can happen again for a number of reasons. Injury. Sometimes an individual may have damage to the lung that leads to bleeding into the pleural space. So that's bad too. So here's an example of what happens when pneumothorax occurs. So here is a puncture. Air outside rushes in. It's really important for there to be no air inside the pleural space, because this actually generates what we call negative pressure inside of the lung. And as we inhale, as the diaphragm flattens, it increases the space of the thoracic cavity, opening up the lungs. If air is in that pleural area, that won't happen. And in fact, air can escape out of the lungs into the pleural space. Really bad. And sometimes, again, if blood accumulates, you end up with hemothorax. Hema meaning blood. So let's talk about how breathing happens. And I kind of didn't want to get into that too much in the last slide. But basically, breathing involves mechanics that allow the lungs to open to follow the expansion of the thoracic cavity and then recoil. We call breathing in, inspiration, moving air into the lungs, and then expiration is moving air out of the lungs. Excuse me. And this all happens because we have muscular contractions that cause the thorax to increase in size. What that does is it opens up the lungs, decreasing air pressure in the lungs, and air flows in. So air flows as a consequence of pressure differences. Now, I did not put a slide in to explain this. When you get to physiology in Bio-18 at Merced College, we go into this in great detail. For now, you need to understand that there is, as long as there's lower pressure in your lungs, air goes in. You don't suck air in at all. Air is following a pressure gradient. So as you expand that cavity, air rushes in. As you decrease the size of the cavity and those muscles relax, air is not so much being squeezed out, but that means that there's higher pressure in your lungs and lower in the environment, so air leaves your body or leaves through your respiratory system. So inspiration is that active process where air is moving into the lungs. This happens when the diaphragm flattens, right? It's contracting and it flattens during inspiration, increasing the top to bottom length of the thorax, okay? The external intercostals, your muscles between your ribs, contract to actually to elevate and bring the ribs out to increase the size of the thorax. So basically, if you put your hands on your ribs and then breathe in, you can feel the increase in the size of your thoracic cavity, which is going to facilitate air flowing into your lungs. So increasing the size of the thoracic cavity or the chest cavity makes pressure lower in there, and air follows the lower pressure. Expiration, breathing out. Oftentimes when we're breathing out quietly, it's pretty passive. It's just your your muscles are relaxing and your ribs act like springs, and then the thoracic cavity gets smaller and air goes out. So the thorax is basically returning, thorax or the chest, right? The rib cage is returning to its regular size, its resting size. Lung tissue is super elastic. There's a lot of flexibility in lung tissue to allow it to get bigger as we inhale and for it to shrink down as we exhale. When we forcefully push air out, like when we're blowing out a candle or we're playing a musical instrument, the internal intercostals contract to push the rib cage back or to pull it back into place quickly. Abdominal muscles oftentimes can also participate. Your abdominal muscles will push the diaphragm up, decreasing the size of the thoracic cavity, allowing you to really push air out. So it's the reduction in the size of your thoracic cavity, of the chest cavity, that causes pressure to increase in your lungs, and then air leaves your lungs. So here's the picture I was thinking of. Air comes in. So if you think of a balloon here and you pull this little membrane down, air comes in because the diaphragm in a human will pull this whole cavity open. It'll get larger, and just like a balloon, lungs will expand. As the diaphragm returns to its normal shape and size, air is pushed out of the lungs. It's not really pushed out, it flows out. I shouldn't say pushing out because air doesn't really work that way. Pressure doesn't work that way. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about respiration, gas exchange in the lungs. So hemoglobin can take on a few different forms depending on what other molecules are bound to hemoglobin. We have carbaminohemoglobin, and this is, it breaks down into carbon dioxide and hemoglobin in red blood cells. Don't worry about the process. Carbon dioxide itself moves actually out of the lungs, we know that, through the capillary into the alveolar air and then out into the air around us. Oxygen moves from the alveoli into the lung capillaries and attaches itself to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin without any oxygen on it's just called hemoglobin. But once it binds to oxygen, it's called oxyhemoglobin. And that's what makes hemoglobin look even darker red. Hemoglobin itself looks kind of more rusty because of that iron group. The oxygen component makes it look more deep red. So oxyhemoglobin itself breaks down into oxygen and hemoglobin as the red blood cells circulate out into our body, right? The oxygen moves out of the capillary into tissues, feeding the tissues. The oxygen acts as a nutrient. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, leaves cells. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of and this is a really fun thing, it diffuses out of the mitochondria. So think back to cellular respiration, right? When you took it in biology. Mitochondria use oxygen and convert the oxygen to CO2 in the citric acid cycle. The CO2 gets pumped out of the mitochondria into the cytoplasm of cells. The cells are sitting there doing their thing. CO2 can diffuse across the cell membrane. CO2 then gets into the interstitial fluid. So it's like this. I mean, look at this. You have a cell. You have the little mitochondria, right? Looks like a hot dog. This is the nucleus. CO2, which is kind of a blue color, comes out into here, goes into the interstitial fluid. I'm just going to say IF for interstitial fluid. And then it diffuses into a capillary bed. Okay, so the capillary bed. Sorry, it's going to continue going. So the carbon dioxide diffuses into, actually, plasma mostly, but hemoglobin can combine with carbon dioxide, making that carbaminohemoglobin, where it's converted to other things. It gets dropped off in the lungs and we breathe it out. So carbon dioxide moves from tissue cells into the tissue capillary, blood from the interstitial fluid, and then it goes to the lungs where we breathe it out. So here's an example, a picture showing the alveoli bringing in oxygen. Oxygen circulates through the heart. Oxygen's dropped off at the tissues, right? And here are the two examples showing how oxygen gets onto a hemoglobin molecule, oxygen getting dropped off in the tissues, and then CO2 circulating back out and being expelled into the alveoli, and eventually we breathe it out.